the most important conversation that we need to have. Before we could talk about reentry, before we could talk about facilities and facilities planning, we need to make sure that we continue to nurture our children. We love all of our children. We provide them the very best experiences. And we know that one of the most important dispositions that our students can have is to have this global mind. This mind where we're able to interact and connect with each other on many different levels. So we're poised to have those conversations as an organization. We'll be talking more to the community at large in the very near future on this very topic and sharing where we are and how we're supporting our children, most importantly. And we have administrators who are sitting around this table right here who have reached out to their students, making sure that they're comfortable, that they're safe. We have mental health professionals who are doing the same exact thing to keep our children close, to make sure that we're always supporting our families. Again, a very important time in our history. We're at another crossroads, and action and making sure that we're doing our best to take care of our children and our families is our priority. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you. And we are grateful. I would like to take more credit than I deserve, but not really, to have Dr. Rick Kennedy here with us tonight from Rochester, Minnesota. He is a co-director of the Vaccine Research Group at the Mayo Clinic. And Dr. Kennedy, I'm sure you're aware perhaps of some degree of sister city that we have, right? Rochester, New York with Rochester, Minnesota. The original founder, George, is it Head or Head, that was from Rochester, New York, and so named that city after his hometown. More coincidence is perhaps a humorous coincidence. Our chief medical officer of the Rochester Regional Health is Dr. Robert Mayo. No relation to the Mayo family who started the clinic out there, but at least we have a Mayo here in Rochester, New York as well. So I did reach out to find out if he was related, and he is not, he says. But anyway, Dr. Ken, we certainly appreciate your time and like to give you time to introduce yourself as well. And we sent you beforehand a list of topics and thoughts and wonders that were on our mind, both as the board and the administrative team. You see that we have quite a few of the administrators here with us as well, so we'll turn some time over to you, not just for introduction, but if you have some just early thoughts in terms of overview of the things we've sent, as well as your experience and background in these types of situations.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So my name is Rick Kennedy. I'm the co-director of the Vaccine Research Group here in, we like to call it the Rochester, but in reality it might be the other Rochester. I've been doing this studying viral vaccines and infectious diseases for about 23 years. And so do a lot of work with different pandemics and different viral pathogens. And so in some ways, this is a dream come true because it's job security. Unfortunately, it's also a horrible event, this pandemic. And so I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today. I've got a couple of slides that I wanted to go through just to provide some background information before we get to, I think, what will be the meat of the talk. And that's a discussion of the CDC guidelines and how are you guys going to implement it when you develop your reopening plan. So do you mind if I share my screen?
Go for it. Thank you.
All right, it says the host is disabled participant screen sharing.
We'll see if we can rectify that quickly.
All right, let's see if I'm sharing the right screen here. All right, everybody see the slide deck?
Yep.
Okay. So what I want to do is start off with just some background material, move through it pretty quick, talk a little bit about the virus, the disease, and then vaccines. Hopefully that answers several of the basic questions that a lot of people have. Again, I'll move through it pretty quick so we can get to the CDC guidelines and then how those specifically will apply to your reopening plans, and then address some of the questions that Peter had sent me earlier. And feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions. I really want this to be useful to you. And so I'll jump right into it with the virus. This is not the first coronavirus that we've seen. It's actually the 7th There's 4 of them that are endemic. They're present throughout the world. They cause seasonal illness. In fact, it's one of the major causes of what we call the common cold. Very mild disease. That all changed in 2003 with SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome virus. It caused a pandemic, involved a couple dozen countries. You can see there's about 8,000 infections worldwide. A very high mortality rate, different than anything we'd seen for coronaviruses, and sort of served as a wake-up call. The virus causing COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, it is the closest human pathogen to it is SARS. And so you can see, despite being very closely related in terms of genetic sequence, they cause very different diseases, and the outbreaks and the pandemics we're seeing are very different. The next coronavirus we ran into was MERS about 10 years later. That's the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus. This one, not nearly as transmissible, only a couple thousand cases, but it was not one and done like SARS. SARS showed up one winter, was done, finished that summer, and we never saw another case. This one continues to be a problem to this day, years after it was first discovered. Problem is, even though SARS-CoV-2 is similar to both of those viruses, what it's doing today is vastly different than those previous pandemics. So we're not really sure what this is going to roll out like in the future. It could be like SARS, it ends this summer and we never see it again, or it could be like MERS and it's a continuing problem that continues for decades, or it could be anything in between. The best guess is that this is going to be with us for quite a while, simply because of its increased transmissibility. You can see on the screen the number of infected people. I want to point out that no country in the world is doing adequate testing. And so that's simply the number of infected people that we've tested and we know for sure are infected. Various places where they've tried to get a handle on what's the true prevalence in the community has come back with numbers that are 5 to 40 times higher than what's being tested and identified currently. So that infected number is undoubtedly too low, which means that the mortality rate is nowhere near 6%. It's probably much lower. Now, it's transmitted by a variety of methods, contact or touch, either by coming into contact with somebody that's infected or an object that has the virus on it. We hear a lot about social distancing and keeping a 6-foot different distance. That's because coughing and sneezing can spread the virus. In fact, laughing, yelling, talking, singing, all of those activities can spread the virus. And so one of the questions that Peter had is 6 feet enough? The answer is no, but it's better than nothing. When you cough, the particles hit a 6-foot distance about 10 seconds after you're done coughing. If you sneeze, those particles come out at about 200 miles an hour, and they've tracked those particles out to about 25 feet. So 6 feet isn't enough, but it's better than nothing. And finally, aerosol transmission. We haven't seen any evidence that there is aerosol transmission. That's a good news because it means there's a whole different level of restrictions and different controls we need to put into place if there is aerosol transmission.
Dr. Kennedy, I have a question for you. We are being educated on that this virus, there are a lot of people who are showing no signs but are carriers. Is that the same with MERS and with SARS, the other SARS? Were there just as many asymptomatic people as with this disease?
Not with MERS. MERS was a lot more serious. The mortality rate's 35%. There weren't a lot of asymptomatic people with it. SARS, there were some, but not nearly like what we're seeing with SARS-CoV-2. In fact, some studies are suggesting that up to 30% of the people that are infected have no symptoms at all.
Okay, thank you.
What was, do you know the asymptomatic rate from the Spanish flu, 1918, comparably, just to get a sense?
I don't. There were asymptomatic cases, but I don't know if there's a lot of good studies that were looking at that. I think they had enough on their hands just trying to treat people that were definitively sick.
And we've also been told that there are subpopulations that are more susceptible to this disease. Same with the other two that we experienced the past 15 years?
Yes, absolutely. And I've got some slides on that.
Okay.
When we talk about it. But that's definitely true of almost every one of the other coronaviruses, including the four that basically considered the common cold.
And influenza is not a coronavirus, correct?
It is not a coronavirus.
Thank you.
All right, so basically there's hundreds or thousands of types of viruses, but when it comes down to structural differences, there's really only two. You've got the viruses that have a protein shell. Think of it as a racquetball or a tennis ball. And then you've got the envelope viruses. Think of them like water balloons. And so much like a water balloon is fairly fragile, these coronaviruses are pretty fragile. And you can set a water balloon on a desk or a surface, a table, and let it sit, and it's fine. Just like these coronaviruses, they'll sit there for days. But as soon as you bump it, as soon as you knock it off the table, as soon as you hit it with a sharp object or even a hard, blunt object, it's likely going to pop. So that's good news for us. Pretty much any cleaner you can think of will kill this virus. And the outdoor environment is not a great place for this virus to live. You've got heat, you've got humidity, you've got turbulent airflow, and you've got the UV light from the sun. So outdoors is going to be inherently safer than any activity indoors. As far as symptoms go, the vast majority of people, we're talking 80–90% of people, will show symptoms between 2 days and 2 weeks after they're infected. The problem is you're infectious before you show symptoms, and you can be infectious for about 48 hours before you start having symptoms. And as was mentioned earlier, about 30% of the infected people don't have any symptoms and don't show any signs of illness at all. That's an average across age groups.
And they won't show symptoms?
They won't show symptoms.
Okay.
And so they can have it, they can deal with the disease, they get their body clears this virus out of their system, and they never even knew it happened. That's more prevalent in younger age groups. So while it's 30% across the entire population, it's probably higher in your students comparatively compared to your staff. So next, there was a question about comorbidities. We know that there's a variety of factors that increase severity. Age is the big one, but basically any disease that involves the heart, the lungs, the respiratory tract, the GI tract, kidney disease, anything that affects your immune system, you're now predisposed to more serious disease. Here's some data from New York State. You've had about 24,000 deaths so far, and what you see in the table is a breakdown of the percent of those fatalities by age group. You can see that about 95% of the people that have died in New York were 50 or older. And so really it affects the people that are in the older age brackets much more so than in the younger age brackets. And so one thing to keep in mind as you're planning this reopening and trying to keep the kids safe, everything you do will protect the kids, but it's going to have an even greater impact on your staff, the kids, the students' parents, and their grandparents and the community. So there will be a ripple effect of everything you put into place. Also want to point out that kids and students are not immune to the harmful effects of this disease. There have been at least 200 cases of this multi-system inflammatory disease that's harmful to the children and can be quite serious. I want to switch gears a little bit, talk about vaccines for a minute. I'll just pause and let you consider those top two bullet points for a minute. It's incredibly expensive, and it takes a lot of time to develop the vaccine properly. The fastest we've ever been able to do it was back in the Ebola outbreak back in 2015, 2016. It took 4 years, and that's because there was tremendous amount of public and political support worldwide to get a vaccine. We're in the same situation, and arguably there's a lot more support. So there's been a push to sort of cut as many corners off the process as we can. And that's fine up to a point, but the process takes so long because it's vitally important that we have a vaccine that's both safe and effective. the bottom of the screen, you can see the clinical trial process. And I want to point out that only about 6% of vaccines really make it through to licensure. Most vaccines fail during the clinical trial period, during that phase 1 to phase 3. This slide shows most of the top candidates that are in clinical trials and what phase they're in. It's really not important the details about individual vaccines. They're color-coded by the type of vaccine. So the take-home message is we've got a bunch of candidates in clinical trials. There's a bunch of different types of vaccines that we're trying. So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. Some of them are moving pretty good from phase 1 to phase 2, but don't expect all of these to be successful. And there's probably another 100 or so vaccines that are in the preclinical realm that are being worked on, and they will move shortly into phase 1 clinical trials. You'll see more and more of these over the next months and probably years. You've probably heard about the Moderna mRNA vaccine. That's the top one listed. I want to point out that we've never licensed a mRNA vaccine ever. So it's a little bit of groundbreaking new territory for us here. And also, unlike any vaccine that's ever come before, the scientific community doesn't have a lot of data. They haven't published anything on any of their results. About all that we know is the press release that showed up a couple of weeks ago, Monday morning, in the New York Times, that said, hey, we've studied 8 people and it looks like it's fantastic. And so I'd caution us to be, don't put a lot of hope in having a vaccine this fall. In fact, I think that's an unrealistic timeline. It'd be fantastic if I'm wrong and we get a vaccine by that fall, but I don't think it's going to happen, simply because the process takes time to do right. So I would not plan on having one in time for your reopening approach. There was a question about herd immunity. Basically, that's anything that blocks transmission. And so what we're trying to do is stop person A from transmitting it to person B, to person C, and to person D. So if person B is immune, whether that's a vaccine or whether they've been exposed and now they're protected, if they're immune, it stops that transmission chain. That means person C and person D are protected. They didn't have to do anything. Now, our best guess, based on how transmissible this virus is that we would need 60 to 75% of the population to be immune in order to stop outbreaks and stop the spread. Problem is, every single one of us on this call has been infected with a coronavirus, probably repeatedly throughout our lives. Immunity doesn't last very long to the endemic coronaviruses, and we don't know how long it will last to SARS-CoV-2 either. Nor do we know, once this pandemic has run its course and it's sort of dying down, we don't know how much of the population will be protected. So I think it would be dangerous for us to put a lot of hopes into herd immunity when we don't know a lot of the answers yet.
Dr. Kennedy, may I ask a question?
Sure.
If you go back to the one slide that speaks to the importance of protecting, well, you protect kids, and then that protects families, and that protects community at large. I guess that's because the statistics speak to, the birth through 18 years old, the statistics look pretty promising, and then you have asymptomatic carriers. So can you speak more about that piece on, dotting our I's and crossing our T's there?
So what specifically were you hoping?
So I guess just, just emphasizing the importance of making sure that we're, it's not necessarily about our kids, right? It's
Absolutely. So the children, honestly, this is an ideal disease for them because there's really not a lot of severity to it. There's not a lot of bad symptoms. The vast majority of kids are going to be just fine. In fact, honestly, the vast majority of all of us are going to be fine. The mortality rate's probably less than 1% when you count up all the people that truly are infected. That said, the older you are, the more severe the disease is, and the mortality rate rises dramatically. For example, in Minnesota, your odds, if you get infected, your odds of dying, if you're in your 40s, is maybe 1 in 500. If you're 70, it's 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. And so what we're really wanting to do is protect the people that are most susceptible to the disease. Now, that said, you've probably got students that have a variety of health issues, like diabetes or obesity, or perhaps they've got immunosuppressive conditions, or you've got transplant recipients or somebody with cancer, and they're at high risk of this disease too. And so herd immunity, it typically comes through either being exposed, you recovered, and now you have an immune response and you're protected, or you get vaccinated. But there are other ways to institute transmission blocks. And that's one of the reasons we're doing the social distancing and the masking. So any of those activities that reduce the risk and reduce the spread of the virus have tremendous impact on the community.
Thank you.
Sure. So the next slide talks about disease transmission. It's a multi-step process. First, you have to come into contact with the virus. Next, there has to be enough virus. We don't know how many viral particles need to get in you to make you sick, but it's more than 1 or 2. Next, once the virus is on your body, you're still not infected. You have to actually get the virus into your eyes, your nose, or your mouth. Even then, you're not really infected. The virus has to travel past all of those physical barriers and reach a cell that it can infect. Only then are you really infected, and then it's up to your immune system to try and protect you. You can kind of divide these into sort of the outside group and the inside group of steps. Once it's inside your body, there's not a lot you can do. It's basically up to your immune system at that point. However, on the outside, there is a lot you can do, and it's all about preventing exposure. And so as you think about your plans for reopening, you really should focus on policies and procedures that you think will do one of 3 things. Keep the virus out of the building, kill the virus if it gets into the building, and prevent the virus from moving from any surface to someone's face and someone's eyes, nose, or mouth. And so in concept, it's really fairly straightforward. That doesn't mean it's simple, and it doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do. So before we open it up for sort of the discussion, I wanted to run through some basic principles to sort of guide your thinking. You're not going to be able to detect everyone that's infected or quarantine them. So that's not to say that you can't tell someone, if you have symptoms, stay home. That's a great idea. Just don't rely on that to solve everything. I don't think you should assume that anyone is immune. We don't know how long immunity lasts. There's some evidence from a variety of sources in different countries that people can and are being reinfected. So I know they're ramping up serology testing, looking for antibodies. Please don't assume that a positive antibody test means that you're immune, because that's not what the test is telling you. I don't think you should plan on having a vaccine this fall. If there is a vaccine, it's simply going to make everything you're doing a little more effective. So you may not even want to change any of your policies, even if there is a vaccine. The next thing to keep in mind is every single activity that you're engaged in is going to have an element of risk. And more people, longer time, being inside and having close contact all increase that risk. Also, risk is going to change over time. Right now, if you're not seeing a lot of cases, some activities may be safe, but what if this fall, say September, October, November rolls around and the number of cases skyrockets and you have 10 times as many cases? You want to be able to be flexible enough to say, okay, the situation has changed. Maybe the policies and plans that we have in place need to change as well.
Is that fall spike, is that generally attributed to the fact that more people are indoors because it's getting cooler?
That's definitely part of it. You get people inside, and that's a better place for the virus to survive, and you get them into close contact with one another.
Hey, Rick. Rick, this is Damon Buffum. So another question or observation is that given that we don't know really what levels of herd immunity we need to reach, and we don't know how long immunity will last once we have herd immunity or we have a vaccine, it seems like this is the new normal. It's not a temporary situation. This is the new permanent situation. at least for, I don't know what gets rid of this issue, but is that a correct assumption?
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption. Until we have sort of a vaccine that we know is safe and effective, and there's enough doses for everyone, and the vast majority of people are now vaccinated and immune, I don't think we're going to reach that herd immunity step. I'll give you one example. The Scandinavian countries, all of them but Sweden, decided to lock down, sort of shelter in place, do the social distancing, and Sweden said, we don't care, it's business as usual, we're all going to develop herd immunity, and then we'll be fine. And then they did those separate plans for several months. Sweden had a lot more cases and a lot more fatalities than the other Scandinavian countries. And then when all was said and done, they started looking at herd immunity, and they found that only about somewhere between 10 and 20% of their population was positive for antibody, which means they're nowhere near herd immunity, and they just let it run amok. So I don't know how or when or if we'll reach herd immunity just relying on the virus to do the work for us.
How will we know if we reach herd immunity if you said a positive antibody test doesn't mean you're immune?
That's a great question. We may never know.
And are they making progress on the antibody tests? That, because I know I'm reading they're 50-50. Can toss a coin for that.
Right. The problem with the antibody test is it takes a while for your body to develop antibodies, and it's not a yes-no thing. It's a little bit like a dimmer switch. You could have two people exposed at the same time. They'll develop antibodies at more or less the same rate, but one person may have 5, 10, 20, 50 times as much antibody. The more antibody you have, the easier it is to detect. So some of these people that test negative by the serology, either they don't have antibody or they have antibody that's so low it wasn't detectable by the test. Over time, I think these tests will be more and more sensitive, but there's the timing issue, and then there's the how much antibody can we reliably detect issue. Those are complicating the problem right now.
How is all that we're doing right now, especially with the deep cleaning and the sanitizing, how is that affecting our ability to develop antibodies for other diseases? And I've in the past 15 years, we've spent a lot of money on Purell and hand sanitizers. And I say that, having just retired, that a lot of times our kids tend to be a little bit necessarily maybe sicker, or they tend to get sick faster. And I'm thinking, maybe are we killing the diseases too much, and our immune systems aren't developing enough? Or is that something totally different?
So yes and no. So your immune system can't develop immunity until it's exposed to something at least once. That's how it learns. So by removing those pathogens from the environment, your immune system won't develop the immunity. The flip side is, anytime you're infected, it's a race between that pathogen and your immune system. If you win, you get better. If you lose, and it's a serious pathogen, you die. And so I think for a disease like this, where it's not just about yourself, but it's really, I don't want to get it because I don't want to give it to my father or my uncle or my grandparents. I think it's easier and better to err on the side of, let's just clean things and disinfect things.
Dr. Kennedy, can you tell me about the inflammatory condition that develops in children? How common is that? And do we have any forms of treatment?
So there have been about 200 cases in New York. That's where it's been first identified. That's where they're focusing on it. I think as time goes on, we'll start to see that it's a little more prevalent, and we just weren't noticing it before. This disease does a number on our immune system. First, it infects us and kind of runs rampant. And then often our immune system just simply over-responds. And so it's this condition is a lot like an autoimmune disease called Kawasaki disease. It's also an awful lot like toxic shock syndrome. And so your immune system says there's something wrong here, And instead of responding appropriately, there's an over response, and we produce too much of this inflammatory cytokine storm. And that's what's causing the problem. It's shutting down different organs, and it's causing some major issues with some of these children. It doesn't seem like it's widespread. Again, there's only 200 cases that they've identified. And you know how many cases or people have been infected in New York. It's orders of magnitude more.
So,
In terms of treating it, there are some treatments. We have no idea if they'll be very effective because it's only just now that we're starting to notice this, but people are working on it right now.
And are younger children the most vulnerable, or are older, the adolescents?
So if you look at the cases, there's a fair range. It's everywhere from really small children, a couple of years old, all the way up into the teenage years. So I don't know if we have enough data to determine if it's targeting one age group or not.
Okay.
so schools are highly social places, as you know. There's lunchrooms, there's hallways, there's tons of transition, there's choirs that have 70 students, bands as well. Then there's extracurricular activities like interscholastic activities that occur after school. We're really struggling, until we get guidance, of course, from, what our expectations will be. What are your thoughts, social distancing, alternative schedules? I know that they've done those in European countries as well. So if you can comment on those ideas.
Sure. So the two most effective things I think you're going to be able to do are masking and reducing the close contact as much as you can. That's going to be difficult because, as you state, education and schooling is inherently a social activity. There's only a certain number of desks you can remove from a classroom before you need more classrooms and more teachers, or there's kids that aren't getting the education they need. So there's always going to be some real life feasibility limitations on what you can do. But alternate schedules are a great idea. Separating out the desks that you can. There's going to be students that, for either health reasons or mental reasons, simply don't want to come to school, and anything you can do to provide virtual education will be helpful. It may also reduce the number of people that are in the classrooms. Anything you can do outdoors is going to be useful because that's inherently less risky. There's also, as you stated, there's different levels of risk for different activities. So an art class, as long as you're sanitizing the brushes and the palettes and the thing and the easels, that's probably fairly safe. That's going to be a lot safer than the choir, where you've got 60, 70 kids or however large the choir is, all in an enclosed space singing and potentially expelling the virus from their mouths. So you might want to consider, do we shut down certain activities that are higher risk and allow other activities to continue? And then, of course, how do you do that in a way that's fair and balanced is going to be a tricky situation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other administrators out there?
And that also goes with anything that allows spectators. You could maybe plan so you could have some type of a sport, but no spectators, and that gets into a whole nother issue.
Right, and then it's going to be what's the purpose of the sport? For example, a football game, is the purpose to allow the student athletes to practice their craft, or is it for the spectators to see a high school football game? I think you need to argue it's more for the students than the spectators, and perhaps it can be televised, and that's a pretty easy solution, but there's some financial ramifications to that.
Same with theatrical productions.
Absolutely. Yep.
So,
And the contact in something like football, like a contact sport, is that considered high risk?
Yes, there's going to be sports, for example, football, basketball, wrestling. Those are inherently going to be higher risk because of the close physical contact. You've got other sports like track and field. That's probably less risky. You've got swimming and diving. That's less risky. You could argue that volleyball could probably be made less risky. Maybe we'll wipe down the ball every serve with a Clorox wipe. maybe we wear masks. Some sports you could do that. Other sports, it's going to be difficult to wear a mask and still be able to compete. So there might be different activities that you can allow to go on and other activities that you want to restrict.
Such as soccer, baseball, softball.
Right. All of those are, well, soccer, there's occasional contact,
right.
and wearing a mask is probably going to be difficult. Baseball, softball, there's less contact. You might be able to step the umpire and the catcher farther back from the batter. You still got the baseman. Maybe you can get creative with it. Maybe the people on bases are wearing masks. But again, it's sort of a risk reward thing, and everything's going to be there's a trade-off there.
And also, any type of sport where you're exerting yourself, wearing a mask is going to just make it more difficult because you're breathing heavier, you're breathing hotter, you're breathing faster, and I could see where that could be a big concern.
Absolutely, that's going to be a concern. The flip side is that you're breathing heavier, breathing harder. If you're infected, you're expelling more virus.
Right. Okay. Yep.
You need to strike a balance.
Bob Clark, high school principal.
Oh, thanks for the time. Really appreciate you speaking with us. I think one of the things I struggle with when I meet together with county principals is the economy of scale. And so when we have a high school, let's say, that has 75 to 100 kids in a class, the idea of, minimizing risk by bringing in half the kids seems somewhat feasible. With us, if I were to bring in half the students, I'm still looking at 750 kids. And the minute the bell rings and they're in the hallways, it's really hard to minimize any kind of risk. And so, I just, I know we have a little bit of time, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time to formulate plans. But it's challenging to envision any scenario that is actually truly socially distant because, again, every 40 minutes, we put kids at risk as we move them from A to B. And because of the complexity of our master schedule and 87 different elective courses, it's not like we can have the kids stay in one place and move the teachers around or any of some of those ideas. So, I just wonder if from your perspective, if that's something that is feasible really, without us just staying online and having kids at home where they're safe.
Right. So if you wanted to be completely safe, it'd all be online, it'd all be virtual. That's not the greatest experience for the kids. The danger is even if you get half the kids out and there's only 10 kids in a classroom designed for 50 or 100 and there's plenty of distance, they all have to walk out a doorway that's 2 or 3 feet wide and they're all going to go out at the same time. So I know some places, stores, for example, have one-way halls. Maybe that's one opportunity. Maybe you cut the classroom or the class times shorter by 5, 6, 7 minutes, and you release different classes at different times to try and stagger it. I don't think you're ever going to be able to completely avoid the students coming into contact with one another. That's why the best bet is to put multiple barriers in place. There's some things you can't fix, but if 60% of the people are wearing masks and 10% are staying home and you are sanitizing and maybe you have a bottle of hand sanitizer and every student gets taught that as you walk out the door and as you walk in the door, you're using that sanitizer, maybe those little effects add up.
Yeah, I think just to follow up, those things make sense to me, like the sanitizer and that kind of thing. I think that's something that we want to have control over. But again, I just think at any given point, half of our building, on most days, we have somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people walking our hallways, just at the high school. And, and every building, has similar issues around that. The concentration of kids, the density is very high within our district. And so I think that this just presents a different type of challenge for larger districts than it does smaller districts, and something that we have to wrestle with over the coming months. If we were to get 100% compliance with masks and we had every room with sanitizer, that seems like a reasonable option. But short of that, I think that anytime we bring any number of kids in the building, we are presenting risks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And some of that is going to be inevitable. I don't know how you're going to be able to have a high school operate as a high school without kids walking by one another on their way to classes, or even coming in the building and out of the building when it's time to start and stop.
What is your take on, as Bob just mentioned, we have about 87 or so electives. I would see that those electives may have to be pared down. Certain, like you can't do woodworking online. You can't work with clay in an art class online. There's just so many things that are experiential that children need to have that we just can't do online. Field trips, there's just a myriad of things that we have to look at.
Right, and field trips, you might be able to get away with doing more field trips and just taking smaller groups. That might be one solution. In terms of the electives, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. It might be that you decide that there's some electives that you simply don't have a good plan for, and so you're not going to offer. You might also decide maybe we'll set up something that that school is open for 2 hours, and we have small groups come in, and they don't get the daily activity of pottery or art or whatever that, or woodworking, for your example, but maybe they can do that once a week, and that's better than nothing.
And then
Dr.
we
Kennedy,
Oops. I was just going to ask, the virus was first seen in China. Is there anything that we can learn in terms of how it has acted in China in terms of predicting how it will act here?
Sure. So China saw the pandemic did in China exactly what it does everywhere else. It started expanding rapidly. They jumped on it pretty quick and locked down entire cities. We're talking tens of millions of people. That seemed to work very well for them. The number of cases started dropping down. Then they opened up their society, unlocked everything. People started getting back to what was the new normal. Now they're seeing a lot more cases, and they're starting to lock down other areas again. I would not be surprised if we see the same thing happen this fall.
Dr. Kennedy, I heard an interview about some schools in Ireland and methods they were using to control the virus. And one of the things that they were doing was they were grouping kids together, like in a group of 10 or a group of whatever, 15. And those are the kids that you had your entire school day with. So they weren't mixing kids as much as we do. And it really was affecting contact tracing, right? So if one of the kids was infected, they knew exactly who that child had interacted with. And is that something that you can comment on, or is that feasible for a school district like ours?
Sure. So from a public health perspective, that's a fantastic approach, because if someone gets sick, you can track it down to, that group of 10 instead of, okay, this kid was in 7 classes with 30 different kids in every class, and now it's 200 people we got to trace. So if you can arrange smaller groups and the groups stay together throughout the school day, that would be great. Whether that's feasible in your school district, or even if it's feasible from one school to another, I don't know. And that's really going to depend on, can you cluster them in groups, and can you arrange for them to have the same kind of classes?
So I would ask Dr. Finger, who is the principal at one of our primary schools, definitely a different set of expectations and rules when you're dealing with those kiddos. Karen, can you speak to your question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for being with us. This is really, really valuable information. I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to the highly manipulative way in which primary students learn. So much of what we do to teach them is hands-on. There's a lot of play involved, and it's all very social. Also, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to how to socially distance 5, 6, and 7-year-olds.
That might prove hard to do. And absolutely, you're going to have to take the CDC guidelines, which are coming from the perspective of public health and not the perspective of let's educate our children and our teenagers. Several things you could do is take the activity outside, maybe separate them out a little bit, put them at different tables, and have maybe more teachers involved, And, they can still do the manipulation, they can still have that interaction, but it happens at a 2-foot distance instead of squeezed right next to each other in classes and in desks. So you could even continue the same activities you're doing, and if you increase the distance between each child by a foot or two, it's not much, but it helps. Every little bit helps. And
in our elementary grades, especially kindergarten, we're implementing a play-based education, and this just goes totally against all that whole process is involved with. So I'm trying to wrap my head around, how do we get 5-year-olds to play but don't play with another child but keep a distance?
Right. Now, if those children were wearing masks and you could get them to really embrace the idea of, I'm wearing a mask, so this protects other people and it protects me, that's going to help. And maybe between that and, hey, everybody, it's a hand washing break, we're going to see who can wash their hands the longest type of thing. Maybe you do that periodically. Now you're reducing the chances of and the risks of transmission, but you're still doing the same activities.
Speaking of masks, is there much research on how long masks are good for before that they break down and they don't really provide any help?
I know people are looking at it. I haven't seen a lot of good, solid data out of it. We know that the masks work. The virus is small enough to fly right through any mask we've got, even the N95s. But that's not really what you're trying to stop. You're talking about stopping someone coughing, and now the virus is stuck in little droplets of saliva. Now the masks are really good at stopping that. The other thing to consider is the mask only protects you from here down. So if the virus gets in your eyes, it's just as bad. It can infect you. So I'd wear the masks until they're either visibly soiled or they don't stay attached where they need to be.
I want to get back to, I have some vaccine questions again. Is the vaccine, well, first of all, I guess my biggest question is, do we trust a vaccine that's developed at warp speed? I mean, my late husband used to develop vaccines. He did what you do. So I'm that proverbial person with a little bit of knowledge, but not a lot. And I just recall it taking years and years and years. My children he worked on the HIV vaccine, was the first thing when we moved here. And my kids were in the human trials. But those trials came after years of animal trials. Do we trust something? I mean, I read that one of the companies is doing animal and human trials simultaneously. I don't know much, but I never heard of that.
Right. So one thing, to put it into perspective, the Ebola vaccine, fastest we've ever developed it, was 4 years. Now, one of the reasons it was so quick was there was a push to get it done. And part of it was some of the work was already being done prior to that 4-year mark. So a lot of the vaccines, in fact, nearly every one of those vaccines that I showed on that other slide that are in clinical trials right now, just months after we've identified this virus, they were based on formulations and platforms, vaccine platforms that the company started working on after SARS and MERS. So really there's, in some cases, a decade worth of experience with this platform. And then what happened was November, December, where there's this new disease, January, they sequence the virus, and then these companies jump on it, switch gears, and now they've got a new vaccine. It's not really new. They've had a head start, and they've just been able to take advantage of all of the work from SARS and MERS. So that's one good sign. The other odd thing about the current regulatory environment is some vaccines are jumping right into phase 2, where they see, does the vaccine work? And then as an afterthought, they do the safety study, whereas normally it would be, is it safe? Yes. Okay, now does it work? One interesting, that's happening with an Oxford vaccine. The Moderna vaccine got to jump right into clinical trials with people. They never showed anybody outside the FDA their animal work. Normally, a vaccine would be studied in 2 different animal models. One of those would be non-human primates, because that's the closest model to humans. I think they skipped that step, and their argument was, hey, we've done a lot of work with this formulation, this platform. We've done some of that with SARS and MERS. Can you just take that data? Because really the vaccine's not that much different. And so there's some corners that are being cut that I can see make sense. But I agree with you. If we push a vaccine too quickly and it comes out and it's either not safe or it doesn't work at all, that's going to be a disaster. Now, the other thing to point out is on an average year, the flu vaccine is its efficacy is only in the 50 to 60% range. So we don't need a vaccine that protects 100% of the people, because right now the vaccine we have doesn't do anything because there is no vaccine. So even if a vaccine comes out, if it's safe and the efficacy is 30, 40, 50%, that's better than nothing. And so we can start using that while we develop better vaccines.
Is it possible that the vaccine, I can remember there were certain things when my husband was developing that were good for certain age groups and found it didn't work for people, like one I'm thinking of, it didn't work for people 50 and over. And is this that type of a thing that it might work for different ages, maybe not another?
Right, that's absolutely true. That's the case with flu vaccines. What works in a young, healthy adult doesn't work in somebody that's 65 or older. And so individuals that are older have vaccines specifically designed for them and for their immune systems. That's likely going to be the case here with this disease as well. And so that's the other reason why everybody says, well, why are we trying to develop so many vaccines at once? Well, it might be that Moderna vaccine is good for one population group, but not the other. And we need Oxford University's or somebody else's vaccine that's a completely different platform for the people that are diabetic or the people that have lung and heart disease, or maybe we need a third vaccine for the people that are in their 60s and 70s.
There's a train of thought out there, and I've heard it. I've been on the end of some emails where people are saying, we just got to let the immune system do its job. And what are your reflections on that mindset?
Sure. So yes, that's what's happening right now. So I would argue that there's 370,000 people that died because they took that natural route. That would be my argument. If we had a vaccine, maybe those 370,000 people wouldn't have died worldwide. Now, the counter argument is for most people, especially young children, this disease would be perhaps a non-event, especially if they're asymptomatic. So just let them get it. I would argue that natural immunity doesn't always mean better immunity. And all you have to do is look back at polio, at smallpox, at tetanus, at pertussis, whooping cough. And that's pretty obvious that the people that experience the real disease, for the most part, suffer disproportionately. And compared to the safety and effectiveness of a vaccine, it's a night and day comparison.
So you had mentioned the dynamic, right, of CDC guidelines from a public health and us from an education standpoint, feeling overall comfortable that our staff is really well versed in the best way to educate children.
Yep.
The coming to the middle, right? I mean,
right.
You've mentioned we can't eliminate all risk, and we know that with life in general. So where is it? How do we figure out how to draw that comfort line, right? That we've taken enough steps that it's worth the risk of bringing the students in, because for me, I'm not necessarily worried about the student population. As you said, there's such low risk for them, but they are carriers, therefore they go home to grandma. And that's, when they leave our doors, how do we educate them to protect grandma? But how do we come, and I don't know that there's an answer, but I'm throwing it out there anyways, to the middle, from the CDC at one extreme, if that's an extreme, and we're at the other of we want to educate with the best way possible. We're well researched, we know how to do it, and yet there's this risk factor involved.
And especially, Pete, because we have had COVID-19 deaths in our town, and there are children who have been exposed to the people who have died, who have currently working with this disease and trying to recover from it. So they're exposed.
If I could just Dr. Kennedy, this is Deb Miles. I'm the Director of Student Services. So if I could just add to Peter's question a little bit, it's finding that balance of protecting the physical health of our students and obviously the validity of our education, but it's also finding that balance of protecting the mental health of our students. And so while we can argue that virtual learning at home, it logistically is a lot easier and probably poses a lot less risk, I do worry about our students' mental health and lack of socialization with peers and so forth as part of that learning experience as well.
Thanks, Deb.
I completely agree with you. I've got a daughter who just graduated from high school. She's kind of an introvert, and I was surprised at, normally she's, I don't want to go to school, I don't want to talk to people, but she was really suffering mentally, and it wasn't so much the no graduation, it was the no senior prom, no senior party, no field trips, none of these other activities. I don't get to see my friends, and I haven't seen them for a month, and when can I get back out and see them? And so absolutely the mental aspect is incredibly important. And I think that needs to be kept uppermost in our minds when we're trying to balance the risk versus the reward. And again, I think it comes down to what you might need to do is, okay, here's some steps that we think we can reasonably take, and that's got minimal impact. Here's some other steps that maybe we test out in a trial period, and if it looks like it's working, we keep with it, but if it doesn't look like it's working, we drop them. I think that comes back to that flexibility that we'll need to have.
And I think the mental health of our staff as well.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got 1,300 people that work in our district, and I know some of our teachers are having a very difficult time because they're not able to be with their children. That is who they are. I mean, that's what teachers are. Teachers are, and kids, we're very social beings, and like Brett said earlier, school is a very social environment.
Absolutely, yes.
So we're expanding the definition of safe, right? We say keep them at home and keep them safe, but mental health-wise, they're not safe, right? And socially, they may not be safe. So that's why I think it's good for us to keep a broader definition of safe, and the different personality types that exist with it. So thank you, Deb, for bringing that part into it.
Pam Serrani, one of our ninth grade academy principals, can you please share your question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, and I don't know if you're able to give us a recommendation, but if we had to choose between having fewer students in a smaller location versus putting more students but in a more spread out larger space, is there one that's sort of considered safer than the other, or does it all come down to just that 6 feet apart guideline?
I would say they're probably similar until you consider how are they getting in and out of that space. If they're all going to crowd into the same doorway at the same time, then the larger space with more students, you put more students in close contact with somebody else. But if you can solve that problem, maybe a one door in, one door out, and you stagger the arrivals, I don't think there's any reason not to feel that they're both similar or equal in terms of risk.
We obviously have, we and every school district in the country have a lot of decisions to make, and a lot of we have to weigh a lot of pluses and minuses, and it's uncharted territory, as we've heard numerous times. And I know, Brett, you are in constant contact with other superintendents, especially in the county and with our local health department. Is there anything, Dr. Kennedy, that you feel would be, the paramount, you must do this if you're going to bring kids back into a school at any point?
I don't think there's anything that you must do this. If there were, I'd say, what's going to give you the most bang for your buck, so to speak? And I would say that's the masking and perhaps the social distancing to the extent you're able to do. So I think if you had to do one thing, I'd do the masks. And I'd find creative ways to get the young kids to embrace it. I don't know, maybe it's you bribe them with candy in different classes for the first 3 weeks until it's ingrained in their brains that, hey, if I wear my mask, I get something. Or maybe you let them out to recess, 3-4 minutes early, and now it's, oh, there's a reward for doing this. Maybe at the high school, it's, hey, we're going to get school color masks or mascot emblems on the mask, and we're going to have the most popular kids, or we're going to have the band, or we're going to have the orchestra, or maybe it's the football team. They're going to be the first ones to wear this and make it really cool. I think if you could push that, then that already is going to make a tremendous impact, regardless of anything else you can or cannot end up doing.
And I see an issue with eating, because you have to have your mask off in order to eat.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
that is a weak spot, in my opinion.
So you do your best with the social distancing piece with the masks. We have a few questions. I'm following it on Facebook Live. There's many different types of masks. This is a cloth mask. There's also the ones that, Mr. Forsgren, can you wave, that's the one you have. It's more of like the medical one. Is there a preferred one? I know the N95 is, for our healthcare workers. I could see all these different iterations, and the masks are only as good as they are, as they are sanitized as well.
No, I don't think there's a preference for one versus any other. Just make sure it's covering the mouth and the nose, and make sure it's fairly tight. I mean, you don't want to restrict breathing, but if there's air leaking around all over the edges, then or if the mask is sort of shifted here, I've seen plenty of people where they wear it like this, so their nose is uncovered. That's perfect if they're coughing. It's not so good if someone else coughs on them. So, and in terms of sanitizing it, some of these cloth masks will hold up better than some of the surgical masks that are more paper-based. And you could spray it down with Lysol. You could probably leave it out for a couple of days. And there's a lot of ways, because the virus is so fragile, the cleaners. There's some fairly not so nasty, not so harsh cleaners that are gentle enough that you could disinfect the masks fairly frequently.
Sure. So
I've seen where some people are using those misters that supposedly they go in and they mist a whole classroom. Are those effective?
So yes and no. If there's virus that's airborne, then yes. The vast majority of the virus is probably going to be deposited on the desks and the flat surfaces. And so as long as you're wiping down those desks, I don't know if you'd need to use the mister.
Okay.
How about, this again, I don't mean to nickel and dime you with all these how about questions, but the ultraviolet rays in the classroom, or the light, trying to reproduce that. Air ventilation, circulation in the classrooms, another one that keeps coming up too.
Right, so circulating the air is a good idea. I would say it's even better if you have HEPA filters on the HVAC system. Keeping windows open, that's going to be helpful. Ultraviolet lights, we use it in the lab all the time. We have biological safety cabinets where we're actually working with all of these viruses. There's a UV light in there, and so before we start and after we're done, we flip the light on and leave it on to disinfect everything. So those can certainly be options to consider. If you do install the UV lights, you're going to have to make sure that people can't get in there while they're on.
Right.
And any exposed surfaces, there's a lot of materials that do not stand up long when they're hit with constant UV light.
We've seen in the news that the CDC had a much bigger book of guidelines to begin with, and then that's been pared back and watered down from what the news media tells us. Do you feel confident that there are enough guidelines in that, or do you feel anything's been left out or removed that shouldn't have been?
No, I think they sort of started with, here's everything we can think of, and then reality kept hitting them upside the head. And so they had to pare it down to, it's not possible to make a classroom environment as clean as a laboratory environment. And I don't think there's any need to do that. So I think they're paring it down, and they're focusing on what's going to give you the most bang for your buck. And if you had to have a list of top 10 priorities, I think we're getting to that point.
Are there any guidelines on things like our children who need speech therapy, or physical therapy. I mean, speech therapy, they obviously have to take their mask off. They need to see the movement of the mouth and all of that. Or PT, where they are going to have to be touched and handled. Are there guidelines for that?
So I'm sure that there are guidelines out there. I haven't specifically looked those up. My suggestion would be, yes, the speech therapist has to be able to see the child's mouth, but they don't need to have, they can wear the mask unless they're trying to then emulate a speech pattern for them. The other thing would be, they could sit, 2, 3, 4 feet farther apart if that's practical. The other thing is, they could wear glasses or they could wear safety goggles. That would reduce at least one entry point for the virus. The other thing to consider is, as long as you're washing your hands or you're sanitizing your hands, you're going to reduce the risk. So there's multiple things you can do in addition to the masking.
And so with a special needs population or with younger kids, if wearing the mask is not possible, are those clear face masks? Is that another option?
Oh yeah, certainly. Those are perhaps even better than a mask because they're going to cover your entire face and protect your eyes as well. That's probably going to work well for the education provider. I don't know if those children, those risk groups would do that, but maybe they would.
Right. I was thinking of the educator to wear a face shield. Okay.
Maybe you can cover the sides with paper and tell them they're all astronauts. I don't know, but maybe there's ways to get them to embrace it. But if nothing else, at least one side of the equation, the staff member is protected.
Okay, now the question, busing.
Yes.
We've got buses that seat 62 children, and that's 2 per seat. Obviously, that's not social distancing.
Right. There are places where I've heard that they're doing every other seat. I've also heard a couple of groups where here's the bus seat, one kid's here, the seat behind it's here, and then you just alternate. So now you've got one child per bench, but they're sort of offset. It's not really 6 feet, but it's better than 2 or 3 kids crammed onto the same bench.
So we have these really hot buildings, and we have fans going and not a lot of ventilation. It doesn't make sense to blow air around if it's not vented out.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
Dr. Kennedy, can I just kind of summarize, in as few words as possible? So what I think I hear you say is that obviously the safest thing for us to do would be to have kids stay at home. But as we balance as we make value judgments about what we can and can't do versus say their mental health versus their physical health, the idea here is to check as many boxes as we can, knowing that there's absolutely nothing we can do to prevent this from coming into the building.
Right. You're going to try and put up multiple barriers, and not all the kids are going to accept every barrier, and not every barrier is going to be 100%, but if you get enough of them in there, you've added it up, you've reduced the risk a little bit, and now maybe it's a little safer to do some of these activities.
So
I think that makes it a little bit easier for us to contemplate a plan, is to understand that we're not looking for anything in totality. We're looking to mitigate things.
Right.
So when it comes to busing, eating lunch, transitioning, hybrid models, this might just be a way that we're moving forward as we get to that vaccine, to the next stage of our journey here.
Right. And for example, with the buses and with entering and exiting the buildings, you might want to put staff there and have the doors just simply propped open. And there's some entry doors and there's a couple of exit doors. And you don't have every student in the school touching that handle and opening and closing the door.
Which totally goes against all of our physical safety and security that we've been working on for the past few years about no propping of doors and secure entrances. And so, we've got so many balls that we're juggling here. And
I completely understand that.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Kenny, we are quarter after. Want to be respectful of your time, and really appreciate that one, you were just so willing and grateful. To those who don't know, my niece works for Dr. Kennedy and kind of started this whole idea, and really appreciate that you've given us an hour. I can imagine we could use you for 3 more, but I want to be respectful at this time period right now. How are you feeling about things? For there's more in the slides? I know we got to the CDC guidelines or other things you think are still important for us to discuss?
That was the end of the slides. It was just this to make sure that I made sure I covered everything that you guys had questions. I'm fine to go longer if you need me to.
Anything on this list for those on? And administration, I know you've been texting and other things, but you're welcome to please speak up. I think we've hit a lot of these on the list. Are there anything urgent, especially our...
The one thing I'd like to look at is a graduation ceremony. You know, how do you hold a graduation ceremony for, you know, it's a big milestone in kids' lives, and obviously we can't have a large gathering. You know, that's on the minds of a lot of the kids today. How do we do this?
So I can give you a parent's perspective and then my daughter's perspective, because she did that last Friday. What her high school did was a drive-up graduation ceremony. So there's a big curved road right in front of the building. And so people just lined up in their cars. Everyone stayed in their car. They drove into that roundabout and they stopped at one position and they said, "Here's my name." And they got handed a program. They drove to the next one. They got handed a letter they wrote in 9th grade. They drove to the next one and someone said, "How do you want your name read off?" They told them. My daughter said, "Allie Kennedy." So then we drove to the next stop and they opened the door and it said, "Allie Kennedy." They announced her name. She walked on a red carpet about 10 feet to where the principal was, and he had her diploma in a nice little booklet frame, and that was sitting on a podium, and he congratulated her, and then she turned, got her picture taken, and walked back to the car, and then we drove off. The entire roundabout was lined with all of the teachers, and when they knew the kid, they'd shout encouragement and call him by name. And if they didn't, they just clapped and cheered the student on. I loved it because it wasn't me listening to 3 hours of commencement speeches. My daughter loved it because she got to see some teachers. She felt like it was a recognition of her personally. So going into it, I thought, oh, that's never going to work. Having done it, I thought, wow, that was remarkably successful.
So there's multiple iterations that we're working on, and I know that there's been plans in place. We've had a committee in process, and the whole piece of the number of people in a given space, the distancing within that given space, the spread, you know, the mitigation of that spread. Those are priority items. I'm hearing that loud and clear.
Yeah.
How many kids were in your particular class, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, sure. It was about 450. And I'm not sure how long it took them. We got there early expecting there to be a huge line. And we went through the line in about 10 minutes. So it was moving at a decent clip. I think they scheduled 4 hours for it.
Dr. Kennedy, back to the virus.
Yes.
This is one that kind of snuck up on us. In your field of work, do you foresee more viruses that are going to be this virulent?
So, yes, it did sneak up on us in the sense of the scope and the magnitude of this pandemic was kind of unprecedented. You have to go back to almost 1918 before you see a similar size effect. But in many ways, it did not sneak up on us. Got a slide. Let me see if I can find it here. Here you go. So there's a list of the pandemics over the last century. The last half of the list is since 2000. That does not count any of the large epidemics or any of the countless outbreaks of disease. So in some ways, these never really sneak up on us. They actually happen with fairly frightening regularity. It's just that as a human race, we've got a short attention span and a short memory. And so this happens and we go, what? Where did this come from? Well, 8 years ago, we had the exact same thing happen. A coronavirus jumped species and caused a lot of problems. We just forgot about it. You're probably not aware that dengue, there's a huge pandemic going on in South America and in Africa. So these diseases are always part of our lives. It's just, at some point, we need to wise up to the fact that they're here and they're here to stay and they're going to keep happening. And I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
Whether you feel that these will be more intense viruses as we continue forward.
I think that's kind of hit or miss. We saw that SARS was more intense than any other coronavirus. Then the next coronavirus was even worse, MERS, that had a 35% mortality rate. One could argue both cases for COVID-19. It doesn't nearly have the 35% mortality rate, but we've got more than 2,000 cases. We've got millions of cases. So I think it's really a crapshoot. Nobody's got a crystal ball. So it really depends on what the virus is and what's the transmissibility and what's the lethality of it. And that can be a mixed bag. There's no real good way to predict that other than to predict that it will happen again.
Great. Well, Dr. Kennedy, thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
This is really helpful.
Yeah. We're
Yes,
gonna
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
try to convince you that this is the
Congratulations to your daughter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
And congratulations to you and your wife too for working with her to get her through.
Thank you. We had a lot of help. There was a lot of wonderful educators that she's going to remember for the rest of her life. So thanks to all of you as well.
Thank you for your personal attack on this and just the fact that it puts it into perspective that's very, very easy to understand.
Yeah, your accessibility and patience with the questions and the science that you shared, greatly appreciated. Just as a reminder, this is on YouTube Live and it's also on Facebook Live. Both of those have video recording options, so this will continually be viewed. This presentation is obviously accessible here as well. Your expertise was greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Well, closely related, right, is our next item on the agenda. Let's get back to it, right, is our school reopening plans. And Brett gave us a highlight of these back at our board meeting last week, the 7 different high-level options being considered. I think that we're looking to revisit and discuss still at a high level, knowing that there's no plans we're going to come up with, but to get perspective, additional perspective, especially in lieu of what we've just heard.
I think that, again, we're still waiting on our guidance from the state, and that will come hopefully in a week or two. We were told in the middle of June. We know that in July that our plan needs to be completely submitted to the state. I think, the guidelines that he was sharing about, it could be a hybrid of factors. It could be, using the social distancing, masking, sanitizing stations, cleaning techniques. I think we're going to have to find that sweet spot because we still want our kids to be engaged. We still want our kids to be play-based and playful and interactive and exploratory. What does that look like in this new quasi-environment? That's, I think, what we're all trying to grapple with. And I think those 7 scenarios, there will be scenarios where kids will not be coming to school for a myriad of reasons. There will be staff members who may be impacted as well. So we need to be prepared to be flexible and responsive to those variations.
Do you envision a different scenario for different schools possibly of the 7, that one school would be under one scenario versus another?
I think we have our grade bands, and every grade band is different. And I think, the way you schedule a secondary school is different than the way you schedule a elementary school. So relative to the developmental area, it may look different. But as far as online learning, we're really moving forward with that, and we're trying to get a baseline and develop capacity for our staff. So if there's a hybrid approach out there, we'll be able to accommodate that. We do know that, we'll also have to look at, again, the distancing piece. How do you bring students in, like Mr. Clark was saying, we have between, 1,500 and 2,000 students in the high school. How do you make and live under those conditions for a short period of time until you do get that vaccine? So that's about creative scheduling and looking at different classes, which ones can be online, which ones do students need to be in school for. So that hybrid approach, again, just in the brainstorming mentality, that's why this conversation, there's nothing certain to it, but you have to start looking and thinking in those terms.
Well, does our plan-
And I think we also have to understand that nothing is off the table, everything's on the table, and there might be some classes that we just can't hold because there's just no physical way that we can do it, and that's going to be a tough thing to have to face. But I think we need to understand that is a reality.
And I would be hesitant, not hesitant, I just think we submit something through the state, but something I was hearing from Dr. Kennedy, although he didn't say this directly, I think it's important that we be willing to change course, right? He said you try something out, and then willing to try something else. So we submit a plan, but does it give us the flexibility to say, that clearly wasn't working, we are going to replace this with that and move along this line? To me, that's more important. Sometimes I don't want us digging in our heels. No, that's our plan, is what we're going to do. We're going to stick with it. That we take our lumps when we have to, and we try something different.
I like this, the seven different approaches that you and your administrative team have created, Brett. And knowing that, my opinion is I think we need to look at those 7 and continue to develop each one of those 7. And like you said, Peter, we may have to switch from number 1 to number 6. But knowing that we have those in place ready to roll would be a very good thing to do.
The worst case scenario from our perspective, and I've mentioned this and we'll continue to reiterate it, is the online, the virtual. If we have to go completely online, we will be in a different position to where we're able to interact with students, creating consistent schedules, providing platforms where there's fluid interaction with our students. Now, again, that's our worst case scenario. We are hoping and expecting a little bit better than that, but we'll prepare for that. But we could, once we improve upon that area and develop that throughout our, then it's about backing into other scenarios, flexible schedules. If we're very fortunate, everybody comes in. If we have to do a hybrid, we could still do the hybrid because we've developed, or we are developing that online capacity.
Hey, Brett, I would just point out there's some level of dependency, or not. Our families in Fairport, obviously the families with small kids especially, they're depending on us for some level of predictability anyway, because as they go back to the office or back to work or whatever, having to provide childcare for kids that are on kind of this flexible schedule, I think they just want something that they can schedule around or understand what the plan is, so that they, if we're shifting too often or consistently, it can create a lot of difficulties for the parents that are out there. So
that was
just something to keep in mind.
That was one of the big takeaways through our thought exchange and through continued conversations with our PTA groups. That was something that's come through loud and clear, is trying to develop that consistent schedule, accessibility, office hours, call them what you want, but that level of predictability helps families, and that's been the great feedback that we've been receiving. And it speaks to, again, developing an online platform, process, and system. That's part of that conversation, developing standards, expectations, and common themes.
And not even, go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'm just saying the big takeaway, I mean, there's a lot of big takeaways. That was an excellent session. And Peter, thank you for arranging that. That was really, really valuable. But one of the big takeaways I got is that this is not going to go away, right? This is not something that's going to be gone in the fall. Certainly, even after COVID-19 is addressed and we have a vaccine, there may be something right behind it that we're going to have to deal with, right? So the capacity that we've built around online learning, or the flexibility for social distancing or whatever, I mean, these are things that we're going to have to develop and continue to utilize, and things that we may have to pull out at a moment's notice and pivot to a different way of learning. So I think that we're learning tremendous things and we're learning tons of best practices, but consistency, I think, is really important, and then not letting this stuff go away. It's going to be stuff that we have to utilize going forward.
So
You know, this is a significant paradigm shift for society.
So I want to continue to bring us back to our guideposts, right? I mean, that was an incredible session. Really, the science that he provided, the research-based approach to managing this was invaluable. We're also working closely with our local area, our regional experts as well, again, to continue to develop best practices in our region. And I think when we get those particular guidelines, we will continue to communicate with our experts. Dr. Kennedy is a great resource we can continue to tap into, I'm sure, but we'll continually be basing our process on the guidance that we receive, the data and the facts and the information that will help our community, our children, be the safest.
Yep.
The scenarios are, again, great exercise, to talk about at a high level, but I know that the administrative team, sitting on this call, they're ready and they're chomping at the bit to understand what exactly it is so they could begin to create this fluid, dynamic, different approach. But hopefully it brings our kids back into our schools. We have Colleen Cole, who's our nurse facilitator. We have Aaron Smith, who's our B&G. We have food service here. All these different interchangeable parts are going to be part of how we come back to school. Transportation, the CDC guidelines don't even appropriately translate to how you could bus kids in. So we need to make sense of that as we move along. So very helpful. Again, another benchmark exercise.
And as he said,
Brett,
go ahead, Dan.
I've read in multiple sources that say that they predict that 20% of teachers won't come back to the buildings. And I'm not sure what the situation in Fairport looks like, but I know we have a staff that's varied and important to us, but I think some of them are not going to feel comfortable, or they have pre-existing conditions. So what are the thoughts around the staff coming back?
The staff is incredibly important. Their wellness, their mental health and social emotional readiness, their actual health readiness, we are going to have to be responsive to those needs. Just like we'll be responsive to some of our kiddos who are in compromised situations. And we'll have to understand that as we move along.
I mean, in essence, when we do come back in September, whatever that will look like, our teachers and students will have basically the amount of time equal to 2 summer vacations that they've been apart. And that's going to be significant because there are going to be a lot of children who have gotten into a new normal of being apart, and then starting to bring them back is going to be a tremendous stake from an emotional and social. I think you're going to see a lot of anxiety. I think you're going to see a lot of depression. I think you're going to see a lot of our social, emotional kids who aren't showing anything now, but are on the verge. And this is just going to exacerbate all sorts of issues. And it's not, and I hate to say this, but in a good way, it's not just us. We know that this is going to be going on throughout this entire country. So I know that we will have a great support system that we can tap into to assist in all different capacities. I mean, this is a total, like I said, paradigm shift for society, for human beings.
No one's really ever gone through it, right? And,
No.
So I think,
and those who have, if they lived during the 1918, they're well into their 100, 100 or plus, if they even remember.
And I think that, again, the team that's here with us understands the social emotional components are the priority. They understand the Maslow hierarchy of needs components, making sure that those basic needs are taken care of. Then there's an academic team that's going to be looking at programming to make sure that we spiral, make adjustments, meet students where they are. And again, it's just not a Fairport problem, it's a Monroe County, state, national, world circumstance that we'll be grappling with. But I think that we'll be poised. We're looking for that guidance. That guidance should be coming within the next couple weeks, and then we'll be hitting the ground running.
And that guidance is coming from
The governor. The governor is going to have to give parameters, and we'll be working with our Monroe County experts and liaisons, medical experts, and Monroe County superintendents and other school districts. So we're all, again, working under the same parameters and expectations, and then we have to make it translate within our own community.
And Peter, how are you as the board president and other board presidents? Are you meeting on a regular basis still?
More frequently now, it's almost every other week. I've not been able to make all of them, but yes, they're happening more frequently.
Okay.
Hey, Brett, in terms of fall sports, I mean, some of those sports are, you know, there's a lot of training and summer practices that go into preparing the kids to compete at certain levels. Understanding that, you know, I'll just use football as an example, right? If we're going to have a football season in the fall, they're going to have to start practicing sometime in the summer. You just don't throw kids out there and start competing in October or September. So I realize that there's so many different dimensions that you guys are thinking about and considering, but in terms of sports, are there particular strategies or discussions that you're having around those?
I'm on the Monroe County Task Force, and I represent Monroe County superintendents on the east side, and we're, again, waiting for guidance. I know that there's a task force in the state that is looking at different options, maybe swapping out sports, swapping out seasons, or, again, creative ways to try to address that very question. And again, they're in the same boat as the schools are on waiting to receive that particular guidance. But right now, it's about looking at all the different scenarios. People understand what's at stake, and we'll find out sooner than later.
And then there's the whole economic factor that we haven't even touched on.
Correct. So this will be a continued conversation. Tomorrow, we're going to be right back here, I believe at 7 p.m., Facebook Live, having a conversation with the community on this very topic, and also talking a little bit about our budget and budget process.
Yeah, so no other questions. We thought a half hour, then went an hour for this topic, but we're at about a half hour.
So I'd like to say the questions that are out there on Facebook Live, many of the questions got answered through the actual conversation. There will be questions that continue to come forth. We will create a Q&A, or maybe we could bring them up tomorrow, and that could be a starting point for our greater conversation. Okay? Because we're not going to be able to get to all those very good questions.
You know, anything lingering from our board meeting last week relative to the 7 scenarios? No? Then we can move on to our final topic, which is because we know there's been questions out there about this, but our capital improvement project passed, right, in the community back in December. And we appreciate Novella Campus Construction, I believe, people joining us tonight, also remotely. Thank you to talk about both timelines, but I think there are other questions out there as well. There is a prepared deck that was available on board docs. Well, is that what we're going to go through first?
Yeah, the timeline.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you all, administrators who shared their time with us. I know you're completely invested, and you'll be a very important part of the conversation. Thank you for being with us.
That doesn't mean you have to drop off. You don't want to, right?
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you guys. Thank you for everything.
Tony, can you show that?
Oh.
Yeah, just that one
Are
slide.
you sharing your screen?
No, I think Tony has. You have the slide, Tony? There it is. Okay, so LaBelle's here.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, go for it.
Right, so with us tonight, we do have Troy Williams and Kevin Rademacher from Labella, as well as Mark Esposito with Campus Construction Management. So I'm just going to ask as we're through the design stage, as we continue to progress through the design stage of the project, which was approved back in December of 2019, like Labella, just to give a quick summary in terms of where we are, the schedule itself, and next steps. And then we'll have Mark Esposito talk a little bit about construction itself in New York State and schools and so forth. So Kevin or Troy?
Good night, everyone. So like Matt said, we're just here to offer a brief update on the design process thus far for the 2019 CIP. At this point, the design development phase has been completed. What that means is all the conceptual and schematic plans that we were looking at months ago, these have been solidified now through lots of research, work with the design team and the district, and multiple meetings with end users throughout the district and at the high school in particular. The scope itself is now more clearly defined than before, and the fine details leading to construction documents have been developed. Our next steps going forward will be to update the high school neighbors on the process of the multi-purpose field design portion of the scope, and then to move on and finalize the design itself and start developing more in-tuned construction details and essentially making the entire set of documents bid ready to be bid on next year. So while we are working through the design, we'll be working with campus to develop a cost estimate based on the documents thus far, after which we'll review the project with the district's financial advisor just to make sure where we are dollar-wise in tune to where we thought we were going to be for aidability. And then move forward to complete the construction documents and submit them to the State Education Department for approval. This will take place in August of this year. We've got an estimated bid period time of between January and February of next year. And we'll evaluate how we move forward at that point in time.
Troy, has the pause order delayed your whole process at all?
Not really. The design team has been pretty fluid and resilient. We've all been working from home. We've actually had more meetings now on this project than I can remember for any other project. It's amazing.
My one concern, as you were speaking about the finances, is so many things are up in the air right now. I'm just in the back of my mind got this scenario that building aid is going to be cut. And that's just the way things are in today's world. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And I just want to put that on the table, that we may have to, obviously, Troy, you and your team are looking at that on a constant basis, but we as a board and we need to just keep that in our mind, that we may have to come back and say, okay, here's what we now know is the true norm or the true reality of the situation. So I think it's just important to just bring that in. I'm just pessimistic about the aid, even though we've been told that it's there.
So
I'm just pessimistic about it.
Mark Esposito's on. Did you want to address that?
Mark can talk about the construction piece, but just, Tim, I totally understand the piece about the aid. To date, and any time that there have been reductions in aid, it's focused on operating aid for schools and not building aid, but definitely something, good to kind of keep in the back of our minds as a whole. But usually, again, it's a separate piece of the pie when it comes to how the state allocates capital aid to school districts based on approved projects in terms of how they prepare their budget as well. So, Mark, did you want to talk any bit about, just construction itself and the ability to move forward within New York State and schools? Because I know there were some pieces out there before.
Oh, can I ask one question first, Matt?
Yep.
That has to do with the design?
Yes.
I'll just go ahead. So you have met with different user groups in terms of the design of the cafeteria and the different classrooms. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then do we get to see the final design that you guys have agreed to?
Absolutely. Matt and Aaron, would be able to share that with you.
I would propose, Brett, that we get a meeting for our facilities committee, which we have not had in a couple months.
there's one
I
scheduled
think it's
for-
important that this is all.
There's one scheduled for June 9th.
Pardon?
There's one scheduled for June 9th.
Then we'll,
Okay, I was not made aware of that.
It's on your calendar. Yeah, should be, anyways. We'll make
I
sure
haven't
that
I haven't gotten any notifications.
And can you share those with the board so that we get to see
Of
what the
course.
design is?
Of course, yes.
Thanks.
now we may, I mean,
Brett, I have nothing on the 9th. I've not hit any.
Yeah, I don't.
communication.
Yeah, I don't have it either, right?
It'd be a great meeting, won't it? I mean, geez, I'll be there by myself.
Yeah, right.
All right, we'll make
That's
sure
okay.
that
I mean,
gets-
maybe it's on calendar whiz, but I don't have an invite myself.
Okay, we'll make sure that, yep.
I've not seen it on calendar either.
Okay.
yeah, I see.
Do you have it?
Yeah, I see it right here, but.
Okay.
we'll check with
I
you.
think it was previously scheduled and then they all got canceled, right? So we just haven't heard it's back in place again.
Okay, either way, we'll make sure.
And then probably I would say throughout the summer too, to look at an additional meeting to talk more as it gets closer to the design itself.
So a major component of this work has been those user group meetings, Judy, and to make sure that their input translated into the actual design, and I'll look forward to sharing that with you.
So has our current situation impacted those designs, or, I mean, cafeterias, for example, now that we think about social distancing, did we revisit user groups? Not that you could gather people together. I just wonder how the current situation's had an impact on our future designs.
I can say one particular case, for example, of how it's affected design is that we have instituted hand wash stations within the cafeteria itself to make that kind of sanitation, more readily available to students as they're coming in.
I think it's also important that we just can continue to communicate, because there are going to be residents who are going to say, why are we spending all this money on athletic fields when we might not be able to play sports? And we know that that might be a temporary, but again, in the moment that we're in, people are, today was 20% unemployment in our country. And that doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. People are saying, why are we spending, and again, like you just said about the cafeteria, how do we social distance in that big space? And there are just a lot of questions that people have right now, and emotions are running high in many different areas. So I think it's just the more we communicate, the better off we'll be, and a continuous communication.
The science classrooms that were redesigned, did they have a place for hand washing as well, or no?
There are things throughout in all the science classrooms.
Great.
And the ventilation and the air handling and HVAC, can someone speak to that? Components? Kevin?
Well, we certainly look at mechanical airflow. We have to meet current code and fresh air requirements, so there are requirements we have to meet through SED. Nothing has certainly been updated yet related to COVID, but there is airflow. There's no isolation necessarily caused by any HVAC system from student to student, nor will there be. So there's still that potential that the doctor was speaking of transmission by distance. However, there is the ability to flush out the building every night, and I think that's something Aaron has been looking into and been actually practicing currently. So that will be available to you, but there's nothing that's going to stop, I guess, the transmission by mechanical system.
But again, the airflow units are high efficiency, it's higher efficiency than what we're doing, right? And it's
There's more air changes per hour inherently about the design because pretty much all older buildings don't meet current code requirements for air changes, so that will be upgraded.
Do we have HEPA filter for all that airflow, since Dr. Kennedy just spoke about needing that?
Well, it's certainly something we're investigating with the rest of our design team.
Because it seems as though that would be an important thing that he mentioned.
It was very interesting that he mentioned HEPA filtered in the same sentence. He also said, make sure you open the windows. And it totally defeats the HEPA filter because you have your windows open.
Yeah.
And we're constantly looking at touch points and surfaces that are virucidal that we can possibly install on any future project, including this one. So when there are opportunities for, door actuators and trying to limit any hands touching doors to open them, we're taking a look at that. And there are solutions that are currently available that we can use.
We have the water go on automatically by hand gesture and soap without touching it and all of that.
Yep, absolutely.
The comment about fields is interesting in terms of there have been some comments on Facebook at our prior meetings and others about taking that money and instead, applying it in the operating. We need to, part of our communication, Tim, that you mentioned, is always letting the public know that just can't be done, right? If ultimately somehow we didn't do the fields, we're not able to take any of that money. It's not a same pool, so it's not applicable. We can ultimately decide not to do it, state aid's not coming through, whatever it might be, but it does not apply then in our general operations. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to communicate that enough. We'll always get those questions, why did we do this when we could have used that money over here? Well, we could never have used that money over here. But it doesn't mean we have to do the other thing if state aid's not there. Those are all unknowns, but we do need to be clear about that message.
And it seems as if the governor is reinvesting into construction projects, so as a way to boost the economy certainly outside of the school.
Right.
So it would continue that process.
He's definitely looking at infrastructure throughout the state, but like you said, I don't know if it's school infrastructure or if it's general infrastructure such as roads and bridges and different more transportation related.
So is there any field in on the overall cost estimate that was put out to the public? Do we think it's still going to come in within that range? Should it be a little cheaper, or might it go more expensive with those types of projects going on around the state?
Well, we've completed the first schematic design estimate, and we came in within a budget from that. So moving forward on this first phase of the project, we're within budget going into DD, which is always a great thing. But what we've seen in the past month and a half of bidding projects is actually that it's become an owner's bid market, where contractors right now, because a lot of the private work is not moving forward, are looking for different types of projects. So going into a fall bid season is a school district right now is going to put us in a very good position for bidding and getting good competitive numbers. We just recently bid a job at Greece Central School District and had 10 general contractors bid the job, where we haven't seen more than 5 or 6 throughout any of the region over the past couple of years. So it's going to be a very active bid market, which we're going to say is going to bring you better numbers than were anticipated when we put this job together, where there was no labor that was out there. All the labor halls were empty. So we're seeing the complete flippage of that, which is on an owner's side of this for bidding a very good place to be.
Mark, are you seeing cost of materials flat, or are they getting a little bit better?
They've actually gone down just because of current oil situation, and also steel. We saw a reduction in steel by 25% over the past 2 months because people had it on the shelves and they're not able to use it. So you're seeing a lot of the stuff that people were keeping very small margins in their warehouses. That hasn't been able to get let off. So there is a good numbers coming in on materials at this point. And I think the way we're projecting to be bidding here at the end of the year, beginning of next, we're still going to be able to see that out there to be able to capitalize on that for the district.
Thank you.
Aaron, can you take a moment and speak to this past season, the field usage? It was interesting. I was, you know, with my son the other day driving home saying, oh, what was this after Memorial Day? And I would say, well, geez, you'd just be coming back and you'd just be able to start using that field now at the high school, and because it's been such a wet and soggy spring. And he says, yeah, but the season would have been over because now we're in sectional time. We would be. So, you know, the spring, how was the outdoors or those playing fields in the back?
Incredibly wet. I mean, multiple times a day, I'm getting still reports from my staff that, you know, somebody had to be towed out of a wet hole, like yet again. So, I mean, status quo from what I understand the history of the athletic fields to be. So, I mean, even though it was a mild winter and we had a great opening of spring, it didn't change the fact that if we had been playing on those fields, it would have been difficult. That would have been difficult to maintain them the way we all know that they should be maintained. So, from a historical standpoint, there wasn't much difference.
Yeah,
The only thing different was that we were not playing on.
We would have canceled out many a game or transferred many a game to an alternative facility.
Yes, we would have.
Yeah. But I really do like the idea of continuing to bring this up if the board so chooses and allows us to continue to talk about, you know, the progress sharing plans, definitely at facilities planning, but also in this forum. I really think it's great that you want to see the plans as they continue to evolve, and I want you to be assured that we'll continue to speak to the users, people that are on the front end of it. And, you know, I think we were actually speaking to some of the modifications that we're going to be needing to make, like the extra hands sanitizing stations, or, you know, if there's exchange rates that come, you know, through SED, we'll have to monitor and adjust that. So that will be part of the conversation, but looking forward to just building upon this conversation, letting you see the designs as they continue to come to fruition. We really appreciate that. But the first phase, the very first focus is at the high school, correct, team?
Yes.
Yep. Can you speak to that? You know, we're focusing at the high school, and then we have the science classroom at Martha Brown, the technology room at JP, the vestibules in the parking lots, etc.
Troy, you want this one?
So certainly we're in the full throes of design here for the first phase at the high school. In the background, like I said, the team has not stopped working. We've been doing our field investigations for the other buildings. So at some point very soon here, we're going to start user groups, or, you know, ramp up user groups again for those other schools. So no one will be left out whatsoever.
So within the phasing, though, we've chosen the high school.
Correct. We've chosen the high school for the first phase just due to the bulk of the work that is happening at the high school and getting that out and through the SED review process. We expect it to take the longest, so we wanted to get it out there so that we could get the rest of the other schools caught up at the same time when we're all said and done.
Yeah, looking at the construction schedules, we're going to need all 3 summers to be able to complete the work at Fairport High School. And that was one reason it was prioritized to get pushed so we can get it all done within that period before December of 23 when the final cost reports are going to be due. So we're able to get the other schools with 2 summers in between them.
Is the construction schedule going to impact our ability to social distance the kids? You know, while I know, you know, there's you know, we may have to keep kids isolated to certain parts of the building or away from other parts of the building, but have we thought about that in terms of the new pandemic guidelines that we have to adhere to, and then the construction happening at the same time?
So again, before they answer that, just want to think about the timeline, right? And we're all optimists here, right? We're all optimistic thinkers, and assuming that there is a vaccine, or if there is not a vaccine, I think that's a very important question. Vaccination, if it happens January, right, February, when is the first shovel set to hit the ground?
Right now in the spring of 21 is when we would start with some areas getting prepared for having a temporary cafeteria area in the gymnasium was the plan up into this pandemic situation. So it is something that we're looking at as the design continues to develop, and going into this next stage of the design is going to be when we really start laying that out, and we're going to be looking at what we're dealing with at our social distancing and all of these impacts, and how to lay out this schedule, because we have to build it into the contract documents to make sure that the bidders are bidding on the project how we want them to be able to construct it. So that's a lot of thought and process will go into this in the next couple months before we get ready to submit this to SED.
But it might be a real circumstance, Damon, and I'm hopeful, and I'm wishing and hoping that.
I would, yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful as well, Brett. But to be honest with you, I mean, I would not bet too much money on a virus being both, number one, available, but number two is, I mean, developed, number one, but number two is available to all the community the way it needs to be. It's going to take some time, I think, but I get it.
Well, as Dr. Kennedy just said, I mean, the one that went through rushed was 4 years. Excuse me.
And this is something we're dealing with right now on construction projects since March when this came out. School districts were exempt from any of the essential orders or executive orders that were put out. So most school districts, if not all of them, continue with their construction projects since March in doing some type of work. We had contractors and us and districts and architects all had to sit down, put together plans on how we're going to continue working in the buildings or around the buildings with minimizing any impact to them. So you're not disinfecting buildings multiple times. So there is going to be a lot of phasing and logistics that have to go into this. If we work together as a team, with the right plan.
Okay. This is, you mean, are you guys telling us that you've never done construction during a pandemic before? I mean, really?
I'm
kidding.
Like a pandemic.
Yeah, I know. This is unprecedented times, I'm sure. So I'm sure your company, like all businesses, is really having to rethink a lot of things that, just have to be considered. So I understand.
Well, no different than every single business that's trying to start up with New York State. With the New York State moving forward plan, every contractor, every construction guy out there has to put together one of those plans on behalf of their employees before they come onto your site. So there's a lot of people taking their temperatures taken, making sure there's no signs of sickness before walking onto a site. And while they're on site, it's the social distancing, it's the mask, it's the putting out hand sanitizing stations, and it's really keeping construction isolated. That falls in within SED guidelines anyways of the code for section 155.5 that's there. So I mean, there's a lot of things that we have to always maintain. This is just amping it up and keeping it to a different level.
Okay.
So the next part of the conversation was the fiscal components, just to sort of speak about what that would look like moving forward.
Yeah, so again, we talked about a little bit earlier about the two different pieces, and Mr. Forsgren talked about building aid itself and capital projects. In essence, it is an expense-driven aid for schools. Like LaBelle on campus talked about, construction itself, the first portion is scheduled for spring of 21, and then in order to have final cost reports and everything submitted to the state, we really see the first, still on track for the debt and aid, not until the 2022-23 school year, so we're still quite a few years out in terms of when the project comes on the books. Again, that's with the building aid coming on at the same time of lining that up with retiring debt and debt payments as a whole. Those are the major pieces. Any questions on?
Well, again, just to continue that conversation about, state dollars that are associated relative to the capital improvement project, the voter-approved capital improvement project, right? Those are different dollars than general fund dollars, right?
Yes, yep, those are separated out on any aid run, on any state aid report, allocated separately, formula-based on its own formula, aside from any of the other different aids like the foundation aid and the other expense-driven aids too, transportation, BOCES aid. So building aid isn't separate.
But I think it still warrants us to be a little cautious, knowing the time we're in right now, who knows what's going to happen. I think we just need to keep that on the back burner you never know what could happen.
Hey, Mark, relative to those capital projects that were voted in by voters before the pandemic, part of the executive orders, and again, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but was there any reassurances? And I know, Tim, I agree with you 100%. We need to be mindful of the ever-changing.
Just keep it in the back of our heads.
But I do think part of the executive order, it spoke to those responsibilities. Did I read that correctly?
I didn't get a chance to read that portion of it, Brett, but I know it's something that every capital project we walk into is always, is the building aid going to change at some point before we get to the end of it? Typically that line's drawn in the sand when SED approves your set and you almost get your building permit to move forward. So they've known what you have and how you're moving forward. That's really when a lot of the cost paperwork, the upfront, the SA4s, the 139s get submitted to SED, so they get a chance to really see what you're expecting to be paying on this. So I think until we can really go down that path, it's something that will be up in the air with the state, as it always is, until the end of a project.
To Tim's point, though, I think it's something we need to continue to talk about and make sure that we continue to get our assurances 100%, and I appreciate that thought.
Yep.
Anything else? Anything from board members?
So I would make a recommendation that we continue to have this as a workshop topic through the summer, because I know that this work continues, the board continues to meet, and I know the facilities planning will be sharing their insights and thoughts about the design phase and the next steps. So we can continue to have this in this forum, so the dialogue can continue and the awareness of the board of the process, that would be important.
Okay. An open discussion. Very good. Well, there's nothing else on the agenda. We have a few minutes left. Not that I want to necessarily make that open, but any comments?
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kevin.
Yes, thank you for updating us.
I would, if the board.
Again, have a good evening.
I know.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
I know it's a board workshop, but I know that what's weighing heavily on my mind is what's been happening in our nation, and the riveting effects of the, what's been happening each night for the past, I think, 6 nights. So the protesting that's been occurring. Tomorrow we're meeting at 5 o'clock with our Diversity Council and our Lead by Example group. We're looking forward to having a conversation to touch base. I invited the whole board to be a part of that conversation, so I hope you've seen those invites. By all means, before we go live on at 7, we'll be doing that at 5. But I just want to have that conversation. This is a very important priority for the Board of Education, and I would really want to hear from you at this point.
I've been working on it from the village standpoint. We've been having constant updates from our police chief, and we've had officers who actually were down in the city. We've had officers who were dealing with a couple significant issues in the town because the sheriffs were busy. We've had 6 officers on pretty much around the clock, where we normally have 2. And it's been very, I would say it's been very good in our community. We've been very fortunate that the people in our community have understood that violence is not the way to solve your problems. So it's from a community standpoint, I'm talking about the community of Parenton. We've been fortunate that we have a community base that really understands violence is not how we solve problems. But on the other hand, we need to start addressing these issues and stop pretending that they're not happening.
And I think that's what I hear about, is I hear about the kind of visceral level pain that these systemic issues cause, and these incidents that I think have always happened, but people are now seeing them on video and they're not deniable, and they're heart-wrenching. And I think for the people that are experiencing them, the pain that they leave, I think they struggle with ways to express it that can effectively bring about change. So I think that's where we all come in to try to find ways to help.
I think we're poised to continue to have conversation about using our lot, our position, to influence policy and practice. I know from a curriculum component, how do we build a curriculum and that really grapples with these concepts K-12, beyond just the history textbooks? How do you make it a fluid, live, living curriculum where students can explore and at a developmentally appropriate level? The curriculum is something that all students are supposed to be engaged in. So that's one piece. Again, policy, there's a policy committee that I know that this group is really interested in making sure that our policies are culturally responsive. And it's something that I know that the board has been saying before all this, which feels really good. But we're at a point where we need to continue to move that work forward in those realms.
I agree.
So that'll be tomorrow night.
Fred, I mean, without getting political, it's impossible not to, right? These are real issues with real people, and rioting is the mouthpiece of the people that feel like they're not being heard any other way, right? And I know that we live in Fairport, which is a suburb, but we have our own minority population, and we have concentrations of minority population that may feel like they're targeted, and living with racism is a real issue for them. And I just think it's very difficult for us. And I think I applaud us for doing everything we can do, and I think we need to continue. It just is so difficult when we have a president that is so blatantly, militaristic, really, in his approach to law and order. And he's firing tear gas at protesters outside of the White House right now. So, whatever we do locally, it's all muted by the huge voice that we have nationally. It's just so difficult, and it's quite honestly, it's depressing, and it's depressing for me as a white man, right? I can only I can't even imagine what it means to real minorities, right? To live in this country with our president behaving and speaking the way he does. So, just my own comments. I know it's depressing, and I'm just a little bit bummed out.
What I was very great to hear and see yesterday was how many hundreds of people from all over Monroe County went downtown Rochester and said, what can we do to help clean this mess up? And that was just, I was floored from such a positive response from so many people saying, this is ridiculous. This has to stop. And these weren't just people in the city. These were people from all over the county who went down and said, please tell us what we can do to help you. And it was amazing how many people turned out for that. That's one tiny itty bitty 1-inch step in a 25-mile long journey that we have to take.
Well, cleaning up the mess is one issue, right? But eliminating the conditions that create the mess.
Absolutely.
That's a bigger issue, right?
Absolutely. So, absolutely. I get all that. And
I thought it was encouraging that there were police officers around the country that stood with or knelt with the protesters.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very big step, because often, I've always felt, where are the good cops? We know most of them are good. Why don't they speak up? And now they are. And they're saying, this should not have happened, and we stand with you. And I think that is a real step.
I would like to think, I understand, Damon, what you're saying about this being depressing with the president, but I also hope that it's really such an atrocity that it causes more people to speak out about it, because it just can't go on. And I hope we can keep that sense of horror alive until November.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree with you. but I'll tell you that there are neighbors where I live that think he's completely right, and all they can see is black people breaking windows, and that's all they care about. They're not really concerned about, senseless violence and police brutality and systemic racism. And I get it. Nobody wants to feel bad about that. It's very complicated. I understand that, but when most people are focused on looting and rioting, and they're not focused on the conditions that led us to this, and then we're allowing our president to say these things, and there's so many people that still support him.
The flag.
It's really hard because I think they have a different news source. I think some people are listening to a news source which is focusing not on the systemic wrongs, not on the issues that got us here, but I have listened just to hear what they're saying, and that news source is providing information to enrage our population at the looters.
Right.
And looters at the people who are protesting. And so I think that just gives it context.
Yeah. Terrorist Antifa, but then we have fine and good people in the KKK, right? Or, I don't want to get too political. It's already too late for that, I guess.
Because Damon, this is political.
That's why
this
I was
is 100% political.
This is
historical.
It
has been.
It's historical.
I mean, I heard a mother on XXI radio recently, and she was, just the simplest example. No matter how much we hear of it, it still jolts me. She was just talking about how last summer, her son, who is Black, said he and his friends were going to Darien Lake. And she said, I bet most of you mothers listening are thinking, do you have enough money? What are you going to eat? What time are you going? Those kinds of general questions. She said she had to say to her son, she wasn't worried about, do you have money or what rides are you going to ride? If you get pulled over, if there's any trouble, giving him, reminding him of the things that might possibly save or end his life. And that is not what any mother and any teenager should have to go through, but they always have. And it is just unbelievable to me that this is still happening.
But what are we doing about it? We are doing nothing about it. I'm sorry to say. All of us sitting in this meeting right now, none of us. What are we doing about this? And that I'm sorry, but it's a very blunt statement, a very blunt question. I'm doing nothing about it.
We've all tried. I don't know what there is to do. I think those of us who've run for school board, we've stepped up at least one tiny little bit to do something. But I think that we've been on committees, work groups. Marty and I went so long to that. I don't even remember what it was called, Marty, that the DNC started. You're muted.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it.
But we went to the first meeting.
But we did go to that a long time.
Kept on going, and intentions were great, but we just never really could move forward. And I just don't know what the answer is. So many of us have tried so many different things. I don't know what can be done.
I've been fortunate enough in my village position that I have really focused when we've had to hire a police chief. That I've focused on making sure that the people we get in that position are going to follow the expectations that we have in the village of Fairport and the greater community of Parenton. I must say that our current chief is stellar in the fact that everybody is treated with the utmost respect. We had a situation this past weekend that could have been catastrophic, where hundreds of people could have been killed instantly. And we had 2 officers who covered for the Monroe County Sheriff's Department, and they averted a situation that would have been on the national and international news. It was that bad. And they used, as I said, they used their professionalism and how they were trained and taught to deal with this situation. And everybody in the situation is safe. Everybody felt that they were dealt with in the most positive, most respectful manner. And I take pride in the fact that I had a part in making sure that that happens in our community.
And those are the things that we can try to.
And of course, that was not put on the
We need more
news.
people of color in every position.
And that was not put on the news. You know,
Because
that,
none of us know what people of color are going through. We need more people of color in leadership positions and.
but we need to
And
reach out
teaching
to those.
positions.
We need to reach out to those children of color and say, you do have an opportunity. You do have a future. We've got 12 and 15 and 16-year-old boys who think, I don't have a future. I'm going to be dead when I'm 25. But we as a community have to reach out to these kids and say, you do have this opportunity. I know that your life has been no, survival. But in order for us to say, yes, we can hire these people, we need to hire these people, we have to have those kids who believe enough in themselves to say, yes, I can be a police officer. I can be a teacher, a mental health professional. I can be a physicist. I can be whatever. But right now, we have so many kids who don't have that future. They don't have that. They don't see a future. They just say,
Part of that,
okay.
Tim, I think is, yes, we can do that. And in my very own family, we do that. But our country, I was going to say the world, but we'll keep it right here. Our country teaches them otherwise every day. When they see the kind of things that we're perpetuating in this country on television, it is kind of overwhelming and flies in the face of, I would say in my own family, the child who graduated, going to a college campus was a completely different experience from the shelter of the support that we provided in Fairport as a community who knew that child as a person and valued him as a person. But then as he leaves that safe community, he's a Black man in America, and we are not changing that.
I've had two of my own kids, same thing.
Right.
Every time I said, you know what? You are a Haitian boy with dark skin who's living in Fairport. Let me just let you know, here are the people that can help you. Here are the people that if you get in a situation, you call me, but these are some people that I know here personally that will help you. And let me tell you, they have struggled in the adult world.
Mm-hmm.
And now, granted, one has struggled more than the other. One is they've both found their Haitian groups of people they've got that similarity. So they've been fortunate enough to do that. But that was not easy. That was not easy.
Well, I believe it's lifelong.
Oh, yeah.
The purpose of tomorrow's conversation with our community-based group is to come up with some action items on how we could support our families, continually provide, supports and what recommendations they want us to continue to move on. So it's going to be, a conversation about action. I'm sure there'll be some processing and some draining off, but at the end of the day, we're looking to walk out of there with some ideas that will translate in our schools, and how can we use our process, our systems to support and enable and build up our families.
And you're right, Brett. It's all families. I mean, there are a lot of families who are not of color who have been earmarked. I know that. I've worked with some of those families. Certain kids that just due to their circumstances, they just don't feel like they have a chance. Granted, this is more toward the race issue that we're dealing with currently, but it's our families, and it's a community's problem.
Brett, I'm sorry, you keep referencing something that is tomorrow. I know the meeting at 5:00 tomorrow, but what is it 7:00 tomorrow?
Tomorrow, again, it's just a Facebook Live session talking about the transition and talking about the budget with the community. It's just Peter and I.
Okay.
Is that for all of us?
Okay.
No.
Or just you and Peter?
Yeah, you don't have to come. Yes, you're welcome to come and show up, but
okay.
This was just a way to.
Thought I missed something.
Yes. You can come.
No, that's okay.
Oh, good job.
I'll be there at 5, though.
Thank you.
I'll be here at 5.
There's also a thought exchange that I'd love for you to participate, take,
Hey,
Oh, I saw that.
go in there and, again, start rating some thoughts, and that's gonna help our Access Equity Coordinator manage the conversation tomorrow. It's gonna do a nice job collating information, helping us prioritize topics of conversation, so we hit the ground running at 5, rather than, feel it out.
Okay.
hey, do we, sorry to be ignorant on this, but do we have an invitation for tomorrow at 5?
It's only about 4 emails I've sent you, Damon, but I'll send you another one.
Yeah.
All right.
We got one from Kelly today.
Okay, I'm looking at my I'm looking at my Gmail, and I know I have a bunch of emails from you, but I'm not sure.
2 T's. You put in 2 T's, you'll be. I'll resend it to you. I'd be happy to. I'm just having fun.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
We get a lot of emails. Seriously.
Thanks. Okay.
And that's why I'm bringing it up, because, it is a priority. I know you'd want to be a part of the conversation. There'll be many good ideas and many people with voices, strong voices, representative voices. I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Great.
We good then?
Well, there it is. I got it. Sorry.
Do we have executive session today or no?
No, it's just generically on the agenda, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, it's all shaping up for you, Judy.
Thank you for being the acting clerk. So with that, a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
No. Second.
Was that you, Joyce? Sorry.
Yes.
Yep. Second, Joyce, Tim first. Second, Joyce, it is 7:29. We'll call it 7:30. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, 7-0. Thank you all for your time tonight and for the good dialogue.
Yes.
Good night.
I'd like to get more of
Thank
these
you
dialogue.
again for
Dr.
I've already
Richard
forgotten
Kennedy.
his name, but he was
That was
yes, very helpful.
Yeah.
very, very, very helpful. Thank you, Peter. Thank your niece for us. That was excellent.
Certainly will. Thanks. We hope to send.
I mean, I felt like I was talking to Dr. Fauci.
We're gonna try and send a thank you, maybe some Fairport paraphernalia or something to him, but thank you.
Thanks
Good night,
a lot.
Good
See you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, you're right, maybe a Fairport mask. Brand new, not used, that's good.
Well, I'll have you sneeze in it.
Gently used, is that what they say?
So we're still.
Send you a couple of gently used ones. Fred, I don't know, look at your calendar.
I'm connecting with Sleeman
is it
tomorrow
off?
to get some.
Good? You don't need a pass, just click on the little upper left-hand corner and it'll turn
Are
on.
we, any of us in exec?
Were you were sleeping? Doug just woke up.
Oh, wow, I missed the fact that it's not even. You need a ride home, Matthew?
No, my wife will come pick me up.
Need a ride home?
No, I'm good. She's coming.
We'll be sitting too close to each other.
That's right.